So, do you remember this? Ghosts of Christmas Past, one of the debates where Joe Biden made the argument that black folks can't take care of their kids and that they should play record players to get more words. And more people weren't outraged by this. In fact, one of the funniest things is when Zerlina Maxwell is engaging a white woman. And the white woman is like, yeah, but he said it so fast, nobody really heard that. She says, whether anybody heard or not, it didn't really matter. He did just say black folks can't take care of their kids. That's the most racist thing I've ever heard. I want you to listen to the question for the moment, though. Listen to the question that Joe Biden is asked. This has started to get a lot more airplay where people are talking about it, and Joe Biden was recently asked.
About inequality in schools and race. In a conversation about how to deal with segregation in schools back in 1975, you told a reporter, "I don't feel responsible for the sins of my father and grandfather. I feel responsible for what the situation is today, for the sins of my own generation, and I'll be damned if I feel responsible to pay for what happened 300 years ago." You said that some 40 years ago. But as you stand here tonight, what responsibility do you think that Americans need to take to repair the legacy of slavery in our country?
Now, I'm not going to give you his weird answer because it goes all around Robin Hood's bonnet and it's less relevant to the conversation. But he was asked this recently. Now, you heard the crowd audibly moaning, "Oh, that's ghastly." Recently, a couple of days ago, presumptive, and I'll show you what I'm looking at. This is Newsweek. Presumptive Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden said Wednesday he was in favor of paying slavery reparations for African Americans and Native Americans if studies found that cash payments may be a viable option. Now, understand, Joe Biden is a flagrant liar. He had to drop out of his campaigns, I believe it was in the late 80s or 90s, plagiarizing speeches, lying about his education, academic achievement, and of course, lying about civil rights. So I would wager to you that he is also lying about civil rights. His position that was given before is a position that is often uttered by people, but that position is utterly ludicrous. I often say whites don't regard their history honestly, and issues of reparations often run into this conversation about white fragility and everything else. Nevertheless, the conversation is on the marquee. I don't think I've ever made a video talking about it, so let's have a conversation about reparations. Often, I've made the point to say, yes, I agree with it, but it is not politically feasible. I think I'm changing my mind on that. At this point, Sanders is no longer in the running, so the issues of Medicare for all and the elimination of student debt and the wealth tax and reinvest, well, those things are off the table. Sanders would have directly addressed those things in the context of his policies, even if he wouldn't have necessarily went for the reparations thing. I, at the very least, could see how that would dramatically benefit my particular community, whether or not it was universal. Well, at this point, the election for Sanders is over with. And I said before, Bernie Sanders was the compromise. And if you're having a conversation about reparations because of everything that's going on with Black Lives Matter, the public's perspective, has shifted in regards to conversations on race, with the public jumping by 20-something points, believing that there's an issue with race in this country. Even among blacks, believe it or not, the number jumping. The conversation of reparations need to take place. If we're going to honestly have a conversation about cops, we are literally, if we're talking about cops, talking about poverty. Which, under this context, we're talking about reparations. Welcome to the soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. I'm going to try to make this video as concise as possible because I want it to be consumable as I make my case. You heard Joe Biden early on, several years ago. Basically, I wasn't alive during that time, and I don't know anybody, nothing. Now, here's the catch. I don't think any African American has the expectation of a vampire walking around where they can basically punch in the stomach and take stuff out of his pocket. The issue is not necessarily any one white person. In fact, I would make the point that the white person, any random person, is not a perpetrator at all. The perpetrator is the U.S. government. The perpetrator is the U.S. government. There's been continuity of the exact same government from then to now. In real terms, you had a situation on one hand. Where a genocide was created, basically killing off my grandfather's people. And then, on the other hand, going about and creating laws to change a man into something that was lesser than a man. Basically deforming that man into a commodity with feet. With the unique attribute that under no circumstances, under penalty of death, beating, or castration, he would ever access his own value. This is just reality, right? In real terms, a spell was cast. And for centuries, you've had a population and a civilization that literally looked at a human being as if it was something lesser than. In real terms, he was not. You even had the weirdness of calling for integration when African Americans and whites were already together for centuries before. It's so odd in the way that laws are crafted in order to shape public opinion and shape the perspective of individuals. Going beyond that point, you had free labor, beatings, killings, rapes. The very structure of society itself had been contorted and situated to ensure that that person understood that they were not in any way equal to whites. And that rational, by the way, from the standpoint of whites pushing this perspective for obvious reasons. But in real terms, art, history, religion, cultural norms, banking, loans, schools, jobs, hiring practices, housing locations, economic station, of course, speech, even the New Deal wasn't necessarily allowed to have African Americans be a part of that process. This goes on all the way up to like the 80s. You realize my grandmother, her mother or grandmother was a slave. Put that in perspective. It was not that long ago. Fact is, the consequences of those laws crafted by that government that did give reparations to Japanese. So it's not like it hasn't been done before. But that the consequences of those things flow all the way through history, literally like the blood in our veins. We can't necessarily pretend as if that wasn't taking place. I'm always enamored by the perspective that it's not. The wealth gap is a legitimate thing. And that gap has gotten wider. Believe it or not, blacks have more wealth in 1960 than they do now. Put that in perspective. That wasn't magic. That was all of those policies that sought to instantiate this idea that African Americans and things that were black were somehow bad and inferior. And that has stretched all the way through time. And we've gotten to the point where we need to acknowledge that. We have a situation where 44% live off $18,000 a year, disproportionately African American. We have blacks dying 3-to-1 from COVID-19. We have, and by the way, just put a fine point on this, because I'm trying to make the basic point that whether or not you were alive during that time period, you benefited. This entirety of this country benefited from free labor. You're at the point where it's time to pay up for the labor and for the burdens associated with being slaves. If you're a white, you have had privileges in your society. Your grandparents have had privileges. Your grandparents' grandparents, and down the line. Nobody said you owned slaves. Nobody even said you were racist. We're making the basic point that this government, this society as a whole, benefited from free labor, not to mention servitude and beatings, not to mention redlining, housing discrimination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whether or not you were a slave master, the majority of people weren't. The point is, there's continuity within your government, the same government that took those policies and fashioned those people into those slaves. Something, by the way, that is perpetuated even today when people are not able to actually frame the other person as a human being, but as an African American, and vice versa. Works on both sides. To put a fine point on this stuff stretching to now, median average wealth by race: whites, 678,000, blacks, 95,000. Median for white. And this goes into, average wealth for white, 678,000. Average wealth for black, 95,000. Median wealth for white, 134,000. Median wealth for black, 11,030. The difference is, median is if you put all of the numbers on the table, let's say Jeff Bezos and whatever, the one in the middle, that's the median. So the median, you get 134. If you take the average, of course, you take all of them and divide it by the number of items. So let's do another one. I'm going to try to go through these relatively fast. And I just read this. Overall housing equity makes up 2/3 of the wealth for the typical household. In short, the median family, the wealth racial gap, is primarily a housing wealth gap. This is no accident. Besides facing discrimination in employment and wage setting for generations, even those African American families that did manage to earn a decent incomes were barred from accessing the most important financial market for typical families, the housing market. Again, this is not something that's magic. These are acts of policy that have stretched through time. Also, think for the moment what it means to have a society that has basically structured itself around the idea that somebody is inferior. Think about the reaction for Bill Cosby and The Cosby Show. Think of the number of people that went to school idolizing Bill Cosby. Husband that's a doctor, wife that's a lawyer, both of them are black, they have awesome fucking kids. God, I want to be like. What happens when that's not there? And you go for generations thinking and criminalizing, not just condemning the very blackness of that individual skin. I guess I'm trying to make the point to you that this wasn't that long ago. You're talking about discriminatory policies going up into the 90s, and then even after that, discrimination from the standpoint of who an individual hired. These things have consequences, significant consequences in the development of human beings. It's not, again, magic. These are acts of policy. In aftermath of the bubble burst, black unemployment rose to levels twice as high as white unemployment, leading to higher rates of delinquency and foreclosures for black families. And the sluggish recovery has only made matters worse. Keep in mind, Obama allowed homeowners to go bust. Blacks, like most, had wealth in their homes, so when the homeowners went bust, those people lost their homes. There was no recovery, or it took time to recover, in which case, bam, got hit again, this time by COVID-19. For the last X number of centuries, you had a situation where African Americans were barred out of certain homes, neighborhoods, jobs, etc. Anything that would allow them to accumulate and to display. I can't say display it in everybody. I'm just saying they were locked out of this aspect of society. So it wasn't a situation where this had went on for centuries and then bam, fall, catch up. They didn't even have, or we didn't have savings in the sense of being able to deal with crisis like this. And they're back to back. This is not magic. These are vestiges of slavery. Here's another one. Median wealth by degree. 180,000 college degree for whites, 23,000 college degree for black. 8 times? 293,000 for a graduate degree, or 84,000 for graduate degree for black. Those numbers are abysmal and astonishing. Here's another one. White wealth surges, black wealth stagnates. Here's another one. 149 to 13,000. This is median household. Everybody knows that people of color are in an incredible economic disadvantage. Right here. Let me read that. But few realize it's as bad or as worse than it was in the civil rights era. Right here. If you look back in the 1968, 9.4. Right now, 8.7. Here's another one. The wealth gap is even more pronounced among less educated Americans. A white household whose head only has a high school diploma has 10 times the wealth of a black family with the same education. The fact that the black family starts off with so much less wealth makes it difficult to catch up, research has found. In fact, there's been no catching up. It's only grown. White, less than high school education, you can see it for yourself. Some college, see it for yourself, takes off. Not even close. The average white household in the United States is 10 times the wealth of the average black household. I think I read that. The average income, all right, $42,000 for blacks compared to $72,000 for whites. That's the median income. The coronavirus pandemic has only compounded the disparities. African American patients bear the disproportionate share of the illness and death from the disease, showing they're overrepresented in essential jobs that require leaving home. Despite the better than expected jobless rate, you have unemployment rate inch up 16.7%. White unemployment dipped 14.2% to 12%. Blacks, not so much. Here's another one. The share of black workers earning poverty wages in 2007, black workers are the only group for whom the share of receiving poverty wages is not at its lowest on record. Hispanic, blacks. I want to get into the effects of this and why I make the point that this is something you have to deal with. Your society turns a blind eye to the poverty in this case, acting like somebody wants to take a nickel out of their pocket. And this is the point that you've had people working and don't necessarily want to pay what's due. This is consequences. The crime, the anger, the frustration, the suicides, the opioid abuse, it has consequences. Fact of the matter is, we've traded this kind of master and slave relationship with worker and boss and worker relationship to a boss and worker relationship with, instead of free labor, dirt cheap labor. A lot of that dirt cheap labor is being done by whites also, so this is not necessarily entirely a racial thing, but it is a racial thing when you look at this broad statistically, and you can see the vestiges of slavery reaching through history. Let's talk about the effects of poverty. Brain development. Kids with poverty, less gray matter. Kids of color, right here. Residents of impoverished neighborhoods and communities are increased for mental illness, chronic disease, higher mortality, and lower life expectancy. Some population groups living in poverty may have more adverse health outcomes than others. For example, the risk of chronic conditions such as heart disease, diabetes, and obesity are higher in those with the lowest income and education levels. In addition, older Americans who are poor experience higher rates of disability and mortality. Now, this is the part that's interesting. Similarly, racial and income-based disparities are found among children. One study found that half of children living in poverty had cavities compared to those who were living above the poverty level. Now, what does that mean? And why am I pointing that out? That may be a no shit Sherlock. They're eating bad food. One of the things that you learn when you have kidney failure is that there's a link between teeth and heart. Meaning the heart disease that African Americans seem to be prevalent with may start at an earlier age. Gum disease and heart disease, the common thread. Here's another one. The data shows that cities near West Side, where census indicates much less. So this one is showing a correlation between poverty and crime, meaning in low income neighborhoods, there's a higher propensity for crime. But again, that's a no shit Sherlock. It's not determinative, it's statistical. If I can take 30 points off the statistics of crime, that's a win. Now, the point I'm making here is, if you have everything that you need, you're satisfied, your propensity for crime goes down because you don't need to commit crime. It's not necessarily going to benefit you entirely, outside of getting pot or some kind of drug or whatever, but it's not entirely going to benefit you in comparison to you going to jail and losing everything that you have. However, if you're in a situation where you need to eat, you need to get medication, you need to get cash, you need to get money, well, your factors change. Your variables become something else. And you may make certain actions in order to get the things that you need. Not to mention society reveres wealth and whatnot, I would imagine that has a massive incentive in pushing people to do X or to do Y. I'm just making the point that in low-income neighborhoods, the issue of crime is prevalent. And if those neighborhoods weren't low income, you would be able to remove crime from those people who are not in those neighborhoods. Meaning, if you grow and thrive those communities, you can take those off of the list in regards to the ones that are associated with violent crime. Make people whole. Here's another one. Chronic absenteeism is a challenge to elementary schools throughout the New York City, but schools in low-income areas like Central Brooklyn and South Bronx tend to have the toughest problems. In District 23, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, almost 40% of the students were chronically absent in 2012 and 2013. Said nothing about race. At this point, I'm just talking about poverty. That's not true. I'm talking about race only because Black Lives Matter is bringing this issue to the forefront, and Joe Biden had to answer that question. And I'm making this argument that this is something you have to deal with because this problem hasn't gone anywhere. And you can wring your hands about it, but the reality of it is, at some point, there needs to be a reckoning where you deal with the legacy of your ancestors, because those legacies, it's affecting us today, it's affecting us now, it's been affecting us going all the way back to the time it started. Whites just never wanted to deal with it. I'm always curious, at which point did they believe reparations were owed? And at which point did they stop? What was the day? And if it was ever owed, at which point did it stop being owed? Absenteeism is associated almost directly with crime. Meaning, in areas with high absentees, those kids have a much higher propensity to end up in jail, which is why I'm showing you the absenteeism. And I'm showing you the link between absenteeism and poverty, which is also the reason I'm showing you the link between brain matter issues and poverty. And I'm showing you the link between criminality in certain areas, or the propensity for crime in areas that are basically abandoned and left in disrepute. Whether you notice or not, cops don't stop crime. They respond to crime. Dealing with the community itself to ensure that it's thriving stops crime. There's a difference in those things. This King Truancy right here.
The DA mediation program, where we assigned prosecutors to go and sit with the administrators and principals when they met with all the parents. And frankly, you know the prosecutors in my office who volunteered to do this? My homicide prosecutors, my gang prosecutors. And they went over there, and I said, when you go over there, look really mean. And so they did, and invariably the parents said, well, who's the mean-looking dude? And the principal would say, well, that's someone that mean DA Kamala Harris sent over here, because she said she's going to start prosecuting you if we can't work this out. And through that initiative, we found cases like the case of the woman who was by herself, raising her 3 children, holding down 2 jobs, and homeless. She just needed some help. But by shining this infrared spotlight of public safety on the fact that her children aren't in school, we were able to figure that out, get her access to services that exist, and through that process, the attendance of her children improved. We dismissed the charges against her, and over...
Just so we're clear, Kamala Harris brought charges against a homeless mother that was working 2 jobs and had difficulty keeping her kids in school. And she considered this a success case. But understand what I just showed you here. The issue here is not that they're bad parents. The woman was working 2 jobs. Clearly, she was trying to do something right. The issue was the poverty. This is kind of the point that I'm making here. That video for Kamala Harris, as she Googled through that, is atrocious. Utterly contemptible in the way that she's making the case. And then to bring charges upon a woman whose main problem was literally the homelessness, not the kids being in school. Between the 2 things, the homelessness is the thing that matters more. I have no idea what services she got her, but the fact that she brought charges against the woman is deplorable. I'm sorry. I hope you understand what I'm showing you and why I say that's deplorable. The issue is the homelessness. If 40%, and maybe this is not representative everywhere, but if 40% of those people are homeless, or the lower income homes have a propensity to have that many more absentees, is it possible, to any degree that's possible, that the issue is not necessarily the absenteeism by itself? The issue is the homelessness. And if you took those people from that homeless situation and ensured they had thriving communities, that if that stat ho with 40% in low-income homes, then you no longer have those people in low-income homes, which means that 40% should diminish to what it is for everyone else. I'm just making the point to you that if you're looking for low-hanging fruit in regards to dealing with a multitude of these issues of poverty, reparations would do it. Not overnight, but it would do it. And it would go a long way to having this honest conversation about what took place in regards to race and the effects that linger to this day. I mean, I had more of these. Even this one. Black babies dying double the risk before their first birthday. A mother's socioeconomic status has access to quality care and nutrients for food have substantial effects on the baby's health, and public health experts say disparities in infant death rates often reflect broader inequalities. According to the new report, babies born to black women were more than 3 times as likely to die from preterm birth and related issues as babies born to white women in 2017. Babies who survive preterm birth can face problems with breathing, hearing, seeing, as well as developmental delays and other long-term health issues. This is supposed to be a feel-good story, this article, to tell us how far blacks have come. Listen to this that's buried inside. Embedded within these trends for African Americans are some troubling statistics. Although blacks are now far less likely to die from HIV than in 1999, they are 7 times more likely to succumb to disease. And blacks have seen significant or no significant improvement in the rate of death from homicide during the period examined. They're still far more likely than whites to live in poverty, be unemployed, and lack home ownership. They're also likely to be reported that they can't afford medical care. Their obesity rate is higher. At relatively younger age, in 20s and 30s and 40s, blacks are relatively higher death rates from diseases such as diabetes and heart disease than among whites, and found more commonly in older age adults, according to the study or the report. For example, blacks in the age group of 18 to 34 and 35 to 49 were nearly twice as likely to die from heart disease, stroke, and diabetes as whites. It notes, these findings are generally consistent with other reports or with previous reports. Last one. Right here. 44% of Americans live off $18,000 a year. The data in the study also revealed that half of those who are on low-wage jobs or are the sole breadwinners, and again, disproportionately black. I understand that no individual white person was alive during that time. Fair enough. But I don't think the perpetrator was any individual white person. You had a government. That government made laws. Those laws had consequences. Those consequences are still being felt today. And whether, again, the entire socioeconomic system shifted in order to have one basic idea that we are still grappling with today, that somehow whites are superior. A breaking and fracturing of reality. And everything, meaning our situation right now, is an extension from that. This is not an argument to say there have been no gains. This is an argument to make the point that hundreds, centuries of free labor, on top of rapes, murders, beatings, attacks, on top of redlining and housing discrimination and job discrimination, those things have consequences. And again, I can tell you, I've had interviews with my grandmother in one of a program that we had for our middle school, I believe. And her grandmother was a slave. So we're not talking about thousands of years in the future. No, the very basic point is that work was done, it was not paid for. This country was able to benefit substantially from those slaves investing, our ancestors. And on top of that, the burden of living through a system that intentionally keeps you as a subordinate class going all the way to like the 80s or 90s. And then somebody turns around and says, hey, you guys had 30 years. You should be up to snuff. This country has to be honest with itself. Like, share,